if you start walking with Jesus, and paying attention to his word, and praying and listening to him tell you to do things, if he has a goal for you of what he wants you to do with your life, your talents, your skills, and your abilities, and you begin to do that, should it be easy? I mean, shouldn't it just be easy? I mean, you have God on your side, for crying out loud, right? So whatever he tells you to do, you'd think he'd clear the path and make it easy. And yet, time and time again, I find that we pray, we think we hear God tell us what to do. Many times we do. We start moving towards what he's telling us to do with our time and our talent and our treasures, and then it gets hard. And we hit these huge obstacles, and things start falling apart, and we wonder, like, wait, whoa, what's going on here, God? You're the mighty God. You're supposed to be on my side, and yet instead of having things go smoother because I have you, God, things are hard. Why do you do this? And then we start closing our own hearts down, start second-guessing ourselves, and start actually turning away from God, and often like quit praying, quit going to church, quit talking about God, quit reading our Bibles, quit serving in the church, and next thing you know, we're giving God the cold treatment and the silent treatment. And we're wondering, why is it like this, right? Why is it that this happens to us? And sometimes we end up instead of acting out of love and obedience, we act out of fear and distrust and confusion. We start operating out of analysis. What we end up doing as people is we sit down and we analyze the situation we're in, and we think of our human responses or our intelligent responses to the analysis of the situation we've done, measuring everything up, and then acting on that. And sometimes we fall away, we look at it and we say, the thing God told me to do can't be done. And so I'm not even going to try to do it. I stumbled across this devotional reading one time way back in the day. I don't remember where I found it or who wrote it, because in my notes I had it in an old file I have, but I didn't have who wrote it. I know it was a CBN daily devotional. And this author said this. They said, perhaps you've wondered, as I have, why God required the Israelites to work so hard to inherit a land he had already promised to give them. When someone offers to do us a favor, we normally expect no strings to be attached. God has a long and storied history of requiring human activity to carry out his will. Not because he needs our help, but because he wants our hearts. I'm not so sure we would relinquish this most vital organ any other way. If God did everything, he'd become a genie. If God did nothing, he'd become an afterthought. If either was the case, the best you could say of us is that we acknowledge God's existence, but that's not the same as knowing him or loving him. The only way for God to have a relationship with us is for God to have a partnership with us. That's his desire. And that's one reason why he won't always give us the easy way out. As you look out over the landscape of your own life, you may see some very real problems. There are giants in the land. They aren't living, breathing Canaanites, but they're a big deal to you. Fear and guilt and worry, not to mention the really big sources of pain like losing a child or watching a parent grow old. If he wanted to, God could remove these giants in his sleep. And we sometimes slide into bed at night hoping he'll do it in hours. He rarely does. And for this we should be thankful, because if he magically removed all of the problems in our lives without asking us to do anything hard, anything impossible, we would never be able to demonstrate faith. That means we would live our entire lives without ever pleasing God. We would gain the promised land in such a way that it would cost us the very thing we need most, a relationship with our Creator. We serve a God who has the ability to do anything but chooses not to. He doesn't let us off so easily. But the real beauty of it all is that even when he requires us to do the seemingly impossible, it is never as difficult as it appears. And sometimes it's almost easy, at least after the first difficult step. In the end, all we need is faith. Midget-sized faith. That's all it takes to embolden us to walk into the land of giants, trusting God to either make them smaller or make us bigger. This metaphor of going into the promised land and seeing giants, it comes from the Israelites after they were released out of Egypt and they crossed through the Red Sea, and you've seen Charlton Heston lead them. You know how the movie goes. right, of the 10 plagues, and they end up at Mount Sinai hearing God, and then they get to the promised land, a promised land that for 400 years they knew was coming. Since they're all descended from Abraham, 400 more than 400 years earlier, he had been promised the land, and the entire family clan knew that someday we have this great land to go to, a land that they would say would flow with milk and honey, and we're going to get there, and God's going to give us this incredible land. And so they come out of Egypt as these slaves, and they're going to get to the edge of the promised land, and at the edge of the promised land, they decide, let's send some guys to scout it out first. Now, the backstory is interesting because how long do you think it was from crossing the Red Sea to making it to the edge of the promised land? I never really thought about that much before. I studied it one time, and it's actually 1 year and 3 months. 1 year and 3 months since they came out of Egypt. Now, in Egypt, they'd seen the 10 plagues. They watched the Nile turn to blood, the frogs that came out. They saw the flies and the gnats, the death of the livestock. They saw boils and fiery hail come down, and locusts and darkness and the death of the firstborn, and never once with all those plagues were they harmed. They watched it in Egypt, and then they get released, and they're let out with all this gold and silver and treasures and livestock. The Egyptians basically paid them to go away. Get out of here and take your God with you because he's hurting us. Here you go, you're set free. They get to the Red Sea. Then they decide, wait, let's go kill them and take our stuff back. And instead, God parts the Red Sea. They get to walk across on dry ground, get to the other side. I mean, these people have seen some miracles, right? They are the generation that saw more mighty moves of God than any other generation in the history of the world before or since. And they go down to Mount Sinai. And on the way down, they have a few problems. I mean, they see this huge fiery cloud that's leading them, and by day it's this kind of blazing cloud, and at night it's a column of fire, and God is actually present walking ahead of them, and he looks like this huge thing of fire. You would think if anyone had faith in God, it would be these people. I mean, they got to see everything, right? So they get down to Mount Sinai. They've had manna. They've seen God do things like they didn't have water for a day, and the water was poison, and Moses throws a branch in it and it becomes clean, and it's good to drink. Another time they had no water on a different day, and he had to strike a rock and it gushed forth water, and they got the springs from there. They've had this manna that occurred where it was this sweet cake like honey, coriander kind of thing that grew on the ground every dew. They could pick that up and eat it. They had one battle with the Amalekites, and they won that one. They saw God on Mount Sinai. God spoke to them in an audible voice. He actually covered the mountain with smoke and fire and thunder and lightning, scared them so much they said, Moses, why don't you just go talk to God, and then you just come back and tell us what he said. Don't let him talk to us anymore. It freaked them out, right? They spent a long time then. God gave them the vision of this tabernacle. They spent a long time building the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant and all these elements and this sort of thing. And then they start heading up to the edge of the promised land from Mount Sinai. I think I have a map of where Mount Sinai is. So there you cross the Red Sea, and the Red Sea was probably much higher back in their day, 3,500 years ago, and would have flowed a little bit different, bit higher. But you can see about where they crossed the Red Sea. So Mount Sinai, way down at the southern tip of what we call the Gaza area, right? So they're kind of the Negev desert and all that. Now, it's debated today because scholars aren't exactly sure which of these mountains is Mount Sinai. And there's another mountain a little bit north that some people think, and another group of people think, no, it's on the other side. Actually, it's where they crossed the Red Sea, would have been that other finger of the Red Sea, and they put Mount Sinai clear across, which is, to me, a little bit weird, because never once is that near the Promised Land, and the route to the Promised Land does it go from there. And I think it's two different countries fighting for the tourism industry. In modern times, oh, we got Mount Sinai. No, you don't. We have Mount Sinai. Come here, right? That kind of thing. I think most scholars believe it's the first one at the southern tip of that whole peninsula there. So that's where they've been, and then they start heading north. It's been a year, roughly about a year and 2 months since they left Egypt. And they start heading up north, and they go north towards the Promised Land, which you can see is up near the Dead Sea, the Sea of Galilee. I think does the next map show, or is it the mountains? Oh, no, this is the mountain I think is Mount Sinai right now. It's down that southern tip peninsula. It's called Mount Jebel Musa, which means the mountain of Moses. And that's where it is, and it's what it looks like from two different sides. And you can take a look at it. I read some stuff there. We'll go back to that a second really for me, Denise. I read some stuff that they're actually finding some like scorched burn spots on the mountain now at this point, these burned areas. They're like, could be the fire and smoke was here. So everybody's trying to like, dibs, we got the mountain, it's Mount Sinai. So that's the most common thought. So then they leave Mount Sinai, they start heading north, and they start complaining because they don't have any meat. They're getting sick and tired. It's been a year of manna. They're tired of it. They complain about that, and God has to send them this quail. He sends them what would be the equivalent of 9 million quail that fly up north, and there actually were these mass migrations of quail that would happen there. Even in the last century, the early 1900s, they would have these mass migrations of quail. 2-3 million quail was not unusual in that region. Human activity has pretty much obliterated that, and it doesn't happen anymore. So they had 9 million quail that came. They had meat for 30 days. They spent this time building a tabernacle. They just before they get to the promised land, Moses marries a black woman. You know, Moses had a black wife. I don't know if you know that, but and his brother and sister rebel against him, saying, hey, maybe I don't like this whole deal. And there's a little rebellion led by his brother and sister, and God has to come down and set them in their place. And I think the sister Miriam was the one who probably led the whole rebellion against him, because she gets stricken with leprosy. And then they both pray. Moses has to pray for her to be healed, and so she has to spend 7 days outside the camp. And they finally make it up to a place called Kadesh Barnea. And they get to Kadesh Barnea, and from there they're going to camp. And at Kadesh Barnea, they're going to decide, from here we invade the promised land. It's like, it's been a year and 3 months since leaving Egypt. And in Egypt they saw the miracles of God. And I think Moses is probably a little exhausted by now. I think he's feeling like, look, I was already an old guy when it started, and we have been through some stuff, right? We've had the golden calf incident, and we've had the quail incident and fire, and twice I've had to get water for these guys. We get the free manna. We've seen more miracles than anybody. Woo, we had one fight, but okay, finally, after all this time, we're at the edge of the promised land. Let's take it. And that's where our story begins in Numbers 13. Grab a Bible and turn with me to Numbers 13. It's going to be one of the first books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. So book number 4, and we're going to look at chapter 13 of Numbers. Now, we got Bibles on the table. There should be Bibles on the end tops and sitting around you, so grab a Bible, because I'm not going to put these verses up. You're going to actually need to look at them. Pass a Bible around if you need to, if you got one spare one on your table. And here's what it says in Numbers 13. It says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the children of Israel. From each tribe of their fathers you shall send a man, every one a leader among them. So Moses sent them from the wilderness of Paran, according to the command of the Lord, all of the men who were heads of the children of Israel. Now these were their names." And then blah, 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 he names who's from which tribe. Skip down to verse 17. "And then Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan, and said to them, Go up this way into the south, go up into the mountains, and see where the land is like, whether the people who dwell in it are strong or weak, few or many, whether the land they dwell in is good or bad, whether the cities they inhabit are like camps or strongholds, whether the land is rich or poor, and whether there are forests or they're not. Be of good courage and bring some of the fruit of the land." Now the time was the season of the first ripe grapes, which puts it late July, early August. So they went up and spied out the land of the wilderness of Zin, as far as Rehob, from near the entrance of Hamath. And they went up through the south and came to Hebron. Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak, were there. Now Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. And then they came to the valley of Eshcol, and there they cut down a branch with one cluster of grapes, and they carried it between two of them on a pole. They also brought some of the pomegranates and the figs, and the place was called the Valley of Eshcol. Eshcol means cluster. It means grouping or cluster. Because of the cluster which the men of Israel cut down there. And they returned from spying out the land after 40 days. Now they departed and came back to Moses and Aaron and all the congregation of the children of Israel in the wilderness of Paran and at Kadesh. They brought back word to them and all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. And then they told them and said, "We went to the land where you sent us. It truly flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Nevertheless, the people who dwell in the land are strong. The cities are fortified, and they are very large. And moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the south. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the mountains, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the banks of the Jordan. And then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, "Let us go up at once and take possession, for we are well able to overcome it." But the men who had gone up with him said, "We are not able to go up against these people, for they are stronger than we." And they gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, "The land through which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants. And all the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. They were, as we saw, as the giants." The descendants of Anak came from the giants. "And we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight." Chapter 14. So all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night, and all the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron. All right, let's pause right there and kind of unpack what's happened. So they're getting ready to head into the promised land. They're camped at Kadesh Barnea, and I get a kind of a kick out of these guys. I was reading one commentator, and he was saying, well, were they in the wilderness of Paran, or were they at Kadesh Barnea? Because one says, one point says the wilderness of Paran, another says Kadesh Barnea. These clearly were two different writers. These were two different writers who told the story, and sometimes centuries later, these two stories were put together, proving the Bible was not written at the time that Moses lived, but it was written centuries after, and these stories have been mixed together because were they in Paran or were they in Kadesh Barnea? And that's what a lot of these scholarly minds think now, and that could be, or you could look at a map, right? And if you looked at a map, you would realize the area of Paran, I have a picture of this? Yeah, this is the wilderness of Paran, a vast, scorching desert, right? And then Kadesh Barnea is an oasis inside the wilderness of Paran. So it's like, can you be in the wilderness of Paran and be at Kadesh Barnea at the same time? And the answer is yes. If you looked at a map, you would know that. No, they aren't two different writers, right? Moses is giving us this story. He's writing and he's telling us. So this oasis of Kadesh Barnea is there. And it's interesting because Kadesh, actually, if you were Hebrew, it's Kadesh Barnea. And actually, Kadesh, the first word means to be holy. It means to be set apart permanently and unalterable. It's to be set aside. That's what that place means. And the other verb, the Barnea, comes from the verb barar, which means to clean and purify or clarify. Usually, whatever needs to be purified is first pulverized and then sorted out. So the useful elements are gathered and stored in the fruit, the shaft, the dust, and other garbage, either blown away by wind, washed away by water, or burned with fire, or simply scooped up and physically dumped. So where they're camped is this oasis whose name means place of holiness where purification happens. It's like, pay attention. Something's going to go down here where something rotten's going to be sorted out and something good's going to be pulled out, right? In this holy place of Kadesh Barnea. And so Moses says, all right, he talks to God, and God says, go ahead and send these guys. So he gets one from each tribe. There's 12 tribes, and they had this law of primogeniture, which means the firstborn son got 2 portions of an inheritance. So if you had 5 boys, you would divide your estate into 6 parts, and 6 equal parts, and then the first boy would get double, and everybody else would get that share. So Joseph, who was the favored son of Jacob, he gets 2 parts. And his 2 parts, his tribe, there's no tribe of Joseph. There's a tribe of Ephraim and Manasseh. He gets a double tribe. So one of each of them gets sent. Nobody from the tribe of Levi is sent because they are the priestly tribe. So 12 spies go up representing 13 tribes, but there's only 12 because of this whole law of primogeniture. Manasseh and Ephraim are the 2 tribes. And they're leaders of each clan. And these leaders go up, and the guy named Caleb, he is coming from the tribe of Judah, which will become the dominant tribe, 4th son in the order of the birth, but he will become the dominant tribe. He will be where King David will come from. He will be where the tribe Messiah comes from. And this faithful guy named Caleb is one of them. He's one of the big ringleaders. He's about 40 years old at the time this takes place. The other guy that we'll learn about who is faithful is a guy named Hoshea, whom Moses calls Joshua. And he hangs out with Moses, and he was from the tribe of Ephraim, which is the largest of the tribes, and is one of the firstborn ones. So you've got these 2 guys, and then these other 10. They go scout out the land, and I don't know, is my next thing a map? I might have a map. If I don't go back to a map for a second. Any map, doesn't matter. And so you can see where the Dead Sea is. About there where the red arrow is, they're starting to go forth and scout out the land. And they go as far as the Sea of Galilee, and some scholars think they went all the way even above Damascus. And they went up the peninsula side, or up the coast side, and then back down on the inland side along the Jordan, made it up into the hill country, the mountainous region around the Dead Sea, and come back to Kadesh Barnea, and they say, oh yeah, we've been gone 40 days. And in this 40 days, we saw incredible things. We saw great land. This land indeed is flowing with milk and honey. Now for us, we're like, milk and honey? What does that even mean to have a land flow with milk and honey? Because we're not agricultural people. We go to Safeway and our meat comes in a nice package, right? We don't. That's where's meat come from? It comes from the store and it's all nicely carved and wrapped, and that's how we get it. Where do vegetables come from? The store, right? How do we get it? So we don't really think much about that because we are a society that's not agricultural. But if you're an agricultural society, what would it mean for the land to flow with milk? It means all of your herds, your sheep, your goats, your cows are prospering. They're constantly having birth, and none of the births are failing, and the land is flowing with milk because all of your herds are growing and prospering. The land is fat for them, and they can eat, and there's no sickness, and it flows with milk because there's always these newborn calves and newborn kids and goats and sheep being born. It's a land that can support vast amounts of livestock, is a land that flows with milk. Why does that land flow with honey? How do you get honey? Bees. Where do bees get where do they get the act to get, right? They got to run around pollinating, right? They fly around pollinating all the flowers on all the fruit trees and all the flowers and everything, and then they come back and they create honey out of the pollen they've collected. So if the land has abundance of flowers and an abundance of fruit trees, there's a ton of honey, right? So this is what it means for a land to flow with honey and to flow with milk is fantastic orchards full of great fruit trees and incredible flowers are in the land because the land flows with honey. Everywhere you go, there's honey because there's so much for the bees to collect. And the land flows with milk because it can support all of the birth of all of these flocks and herds. So to them, a land that flows with milk and honey is an incredibly prosperous land. Does that make sense? Yes. It's like, oh, I get the flow. I don't know. A land flowing with milk and honey didn't mean anything before, because we go to Safeway or wherever. All right, so that's what it means. And they're saying, oh, yeah, it totally does. And they sent these guys out, and they're going forward. And Moses thinks, I'm sending these guys out, and they're going to come up with a wise plan for how we're supposed to take the land. And God says, okay, go ahead and send them. But God knows something that Moses does not. And we don't get the full story until 40 years later when Moses is once again standing at the edge of the promised land, and he's like 120 years old now, and he's speaking to another generation of these people, and he gives us a little insight into the story that we don't get in Numbers, but we do get in Deuteronomy, which means second law. And in Deuteronomy chapter 1, which is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy will be the next book. And check this out, because we get a little detail of the story that Numbers left out. In chapter 1, verse 19, Moses is once again standing at the edge of the promised land 40 years later, talking to a different generation, and he says this in chapter 1, verse 19. So we departed from Horeb, that's Mount Sinai, another name for Mount Sinai, and went through all that great and terrible wilderness which you saw on the way to the mountains of the Amorites, as the Lord our God had commanded us. Then we came to Kadesh Barnea. So he's retelling the story of what happened 40 years earlier. And I said to you, you've come to the mountains of the Amorites, which the Lord our God is giving us. Look, the Lord your God has set the land before you. Go up and possess it, as the Lord your God, your fathers, has spoken to you, and do not fear or be discouraged. And every one of you came near to me and said, let us send men before us, and let them search out the land before us, and bring back word to us of the way by which we should go up, and of the cities into which we shall come. And the plan pleased me well, so I took 12 of your men, one from each tribe, and they departed and went up into the mountains. Whose idea was it to scout the land? It wasn't Moses' idea, and it wasn't God's idea. The people came, and Moses said, all right, we're at Kadesh Barnea. Get your swords, get your shield. Let's march up, and let's go take it. Let's do this, guys. And they said, whoa, but Moses, before we do this, maybe we should, send some guys to scope out the land first and check out, the best strategy. the best way to go about doing this. I mean, we don't know what we're walking into. We don't want to just march in there without knowing what we're doing. And Moses thinks, well, that sounds like a good idea. Hey, God, is that okay? And God's like, yeah, go do that. What Moses doesn't know is these guys aren't going to scout the land to see the best strategy for taking it. They're scouting the land to see whether they should go try to take it. He doesn't know he's sending these unfaithful people who are actually second-guessing Moses' leadership and God's word. And that's what's really happening. And it's not until they get back that Moses realizes what went down. You weren't going to help us figure out how to do this well and wisely. You weren't the leaders going to teach us how to do and follow God's word. You came back as the leaders telling us not to follow God's word. And this is very frustrating, right? And they have these leaders, each of them from the tribes, were actually intending to undermine the project. They were undermining the word of God and undermining Moses. They scout the whole land. They go north, up around the Sea of Galilee, probably even above that, back down the valley. They come to Hebron, and Hebron is just about a little north of Kadesh Barnea, about the end of the Dead Sea. Hebron is there, south of Jerusalem. And so Hebron is there. Now, interesting, they come to that city, and when they reach the city of Hebron, we know that it's an old city. The scriptures there just told us it was older than Zoan, which was in Egypt, which the Greeks called Tanis, the capital of Egypt. So this city of Hebron is one of the oldest cities in the world. It predates it's been continually inhabited for thousands of years. It is actually the city Abraham was at. And when Abraham's wife Sarah died, he buys a field and a cave there, and he buries his wife there. He gets buried there. Isaac gets buried there. Rebekah's buried there. And Jacob's wife Leah is buried there. And Jacob's there, and they have Joseph's bones with them that they brought out of the land of Egypt, and they intend to bury them in the cave too. He'll actually end up getting buried further north than Shechem. So when they come to Hebron, it's like, guys, this is home. This is the place that's home. Our ancestors are here. This is their burial ground. Hebron is home, and this home is turned into a fortified city. And it's this giant place, and it's got these Canaanites living in it, and they're the descendants of Anak. They are actually, the other word used is the Nephilim. These are the giants that were in the land. These guys were 7, 8, 9 feet tall. We know that Goliath would be part of them. There are other giants mentioned in the Bible. Not outrageous. There was this species or this race of humans who were actually significantly bigger than all the others, and they ended up being called the Nephilim, the sons of Anak. Anak was the most dominant one. And actually, Hebron had another name. It was called Kiriath Arba. We know that from a text. And Kiriath Arba means city of Arba, and Arba was one of the Nephilim. So it's full of these really big, powerful guys, right? And we don't know whatever happened to the Nephilim. We know that they find some bones that are super big. And I don't know if you've studied any human skeletons. I mean, a lot of it's hoax out there. But if you study stuff that's legit, they're finding 8 feet tall, 9 foot 2 inch skeletons. They found a lot of these. You know where they find most of them? North America. Wow, I don't know. Somehow the Nephilim ended up over here. I don't know how they ended up over here, but they're finding, like, they found a 9 foot 2 skeleton in Ohio, right? So you're like these ancient skeletons that are kind of, so somehow the Nephilim ended up there. But they're there. Now you think about, well, they're these great big guys. Like, so what? They're not fighting with guns. They're fighting with clubs and swords. It's not even the Iron Age. This is the Bronze Age. And bronze is not great for cutting. And it gets dull really fast. So when you start clanging bronze on a shield, the blade goes dull. So literally during the Bronze Age, swords were more like clubs than they'd beat each other to death. That's how the battles would go down, right? And so if you were the big guy who was much taller, bigger, and stronger, and you could wield a club that was bigger, and you could stand in a battle longer, you would kill more guys than the little people. Makes sense, doesn't it? It literally is measuring size, saying who's going to win the battle. And these come back and they say, hey, we're on average at this time in history about 5'5" guys. And we went up to Hebron to check it out. That's where our ancestors are buried. That should be our hometown. And it's full of these dudes who are like 7 or 8 feet tall because they're the descendants of Anak, and even names some, Sheshai and Talmai, and he names 3 of these guys. We don't know if they're clans or if they're individuals. And they come back and say, ain't no way we're going to win this war. Now, they've already done a head count. And we know from the scriptures, they have 600,000 fighting men. That's how many they have, 600,000 fighting men. So actually, they could win the war because they don't have to conquer the entire land at one time. They only have to conquer it in bits and pieces as they go. And their 600,000 fighting men could easily conquer the land, actually. But they weren't willing to do it because they were scared. And they weren't going to do it at all. So you have this situation where they say there's giants in the land. Deuteronomy 9, 1 through 3 says, "Hear, O Israel, you are to cross over the Jordan today and go into dispossessed nations greater and mightier than yourself, cities great and fortified up to heaven, a people great and tall, the descendants of the Anakim, whom you know and of whom you heard it said, who can stand before the descendants of Anak. Therefore understand today that the Lord your God is he who goes over before you as a consuming fire. He will destroy them and bring them down before you. So you shall drive them out and destroy them quickly, as the Lord has said to you." So 40 years later, Moses is with the next generation saying, yes, you're going to see giants. Don't worry, God is on your side. You're going to win. This generation, though, isn't going to listen to that. And so they give this bad report. These leaders, the heads of the clans, go back and tell their clans, no, we can't do it. And nobody's going to stand up to their own leader. They're not going to look at their leader and say, well, the leader won't go. He's the guy, he's the wisest, bravest, strongest guy. We picked him for a reason because, in our clan, we're the clan of Simeon. He's the best of the best. And the clan that was, Naphtali said, well, we picked the guy who's our best of the best, our biggest, strongest, mightiest, bravest warrior. He's our leader. And if he ain't going to go, we ain't going. And so they break down and they start crying and they're saying, we're never going to make it. The land is full of these other people. We're going to have to drive them out. And we're grasshoppers in their sight, right? In their culture that eats grasshoppers. So think about that. Not only are we tiny, they're just going to eat us up. We're no good. And they all start weeping and wailing and crying. Only Caleb, he's the only one who says, I'm not going to dispute the facts. You're right. There were giants in the land, and yes, the cities were fortified. But we got God. We got God, and God's told us to do this, so the goal is still obtainable. Let's just go do it. We can make this happen. He's the only one of them who will speak up. And so they end up turning around, and they turn on Caleb, and then Joshua will speak up in a moment, and they're the only two guys who will speak up saying, let's take it anyway, and they won't be listened to. And in chapter 14, we kind of follow what happens next. They start saying, they go to their tents and they start crying, right? And they start complaining and whining. If only we had died in the land of Egypt, or if only we had died in this wilderness. Why has the Lord brought us to this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and children should become victims? Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt? So they said to one another, let us select a leader and return to Egypt. What a moment. They're saying slavery under the wicked Egyptians was better than freedom with God. Freedom with God is going to make me pay a price. It's going to cost me something. Freedom with God means I sometimes have to fight for the promises of God, for them to become fruitful in my life. And rather than have courage and fight for the promises of God to take fruit in my life, I would rather go back and be under the wickedness of slavery of Egypt. And remember, it's been 1 year and 3 months. It ain't been that long since they've gotten released from slavery. It's not like, oh, that was years ago. I forget what it was like. No, it was 2 years ago. You were getting whipped, remember? You're getting whipped to make bricks without straw. And they want to go back to that. It's a crazy moment in their history. It's like, after all God has done, after all the miracles they'd seen, after all the signs and the wonders and this stuff, they want to go back to the sin condition of living in the slavery and the bondage under the evil empire. Oh, we don't do that, do we? Right? No, we never get disappointed in God and return to the old life, do we? Why, yes, we do. Right? It's the same moment. It's like, wait a minute, you can either press on with courage and strength in God, or you can do what they did and say, I'm scared, I quit, I'm going to go back to the old life, which I hated in the first place. Right? They're doing what many, many of us do. And Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before all of the assembly of the congregation of the children of Israel. I love that leadership moment. They're getting, we got to go back to Egypt. Let's get somebody new. We're done with Moses. We're sick of you, Moses. You've led us up here. Let's get somebody else. He's going to lead us how to go back to Egypt. You forgot already how to get back to Egypt? You didn't remember the trail you just walked on? You can't do it yourselves? No, we got to have a leader. We got to have somebody take us. Why? Because they have a slave mentality. A slave mentality says, I'm helpless. Someone else has to do it for me. Someone else has to provide for me. Someone else has to give to me. I do not rise up and take responsibility for my own situation and my own life. I do not rise up to come up with ideas. I do not rise up to be creative. I do not rise up to even learn from my own mistakes and carry them. Somebody else has to be in charge of me. Somebody else needs to take care of me and make the decisions for me. See, they have a slave mentality. And this has driven Moses nuts. And it's why they can't take the promised land, because even though they are no longer slaves, they still think like slaves. They still think as helpless, hopeless people, trapped and admired in a condition that they can't get out of. Let's choose somebody else. And you'd think Moses would stand up and say, let me remind you what has happened by my staff and my hand. You'd think he'd do that kind of leadership. What does Moses do? He falls on his face. Meaning, he goes immediately to prayer. He and Aaron look at each other and go, yeah, we need God. Poof! They're down on the ground. Sprayed out. God, you better intervene now. If there's ever a moment we needed you, it's right now. They're bowing before God. They're not taking charge and leadership. They're saying, in this desperate, horrible moment, if ever we needed God, now's the chance. They're laid out, and now Joshua, the other spy, speaks up. But Joshua, the son of Nun, and Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes, and they spoke to all their congregation of the children of Israel, saying, the land we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. The tearing of the clothes is a sign of mourning or just of humiliation. They're tearing their clothes like, we're humiliated you guys are acting like this. We're in mourning that you guys are acting like this. So Moses and Aaron are laid on the ground praying. Joshua and Caleb are saying, calm down. You guys, come on. Knock it up. And they're saying, we could take this land. And they spoke to all the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, the land we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. God is basically bringing us to the promised land. It's a great place to be. He's going to provide for us. He's going to drive these wicked, hideous nations out by our with our help and his help. He's going to help us. We're going to do this, and we're going to take over something that already has all the houses built. All the trees are already planted. The orchards are already there. We get to move in and just take it over and actually pick up from day one. You know how long it takes to plant a fruit tree and get fruit? 5 years. They're not going to have to wait 5 years. It's now. We can take the promised land now. Come on, guys, let's do this. And it goes on to say, if the Lord delights in us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our bread, and their protection has departed from them. Meaning they're our bread means we can chew them up and spit them out. Come on, guys, we could devour them. And it goes on to say, their protection has departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. And all the congregation said to stone them with stones. What's the response of people who are cowards and fearless slave mentality? And the guys who are saying, let's have faith in God. The cowards say, let's kill those guys who have faith in God. We should kill them because we don't like their message, right? And I write the next sentence. Now the glory of the Lord appeared in the tabernacle of the meeting before all the children of Israel. It's like big fight going down. Moses and Aaron splayed out praying. People screaming, yelling, weeping, and crying. Caleb and Joshua tearing their clothes. Come on, we can do this. Let's kill these guys. And right then, woof, the mighty power of God descends right there on the camp. And everybody goes quiet. Right? And God's going to start talking. And God's going to start saying something. And these whiny, complaining people, which, I mean, it wasn't even 30 days earlier they wanted meat. And they were crying about not having meat. In chapter 11, I got to read you this verse. It says, in verse 4 of chapter 11, now the mixed multitude who were among them yielded to intense craving, so the children of Israel also wept again and said, who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish which we ate freely in Egypt, and the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic, but now our whole being is dried up. There's nothing at all except this manna before our eyes. And they don't want to eat. It says, in verse 10, then Moses heard the people weeping throughout their families, everyone at the door of his tent. And the anger of the Lord was greatly aroused. That's chapter 11. So not even 30 days earlier, they'd complained about not getting meat. And you know what they said? Who's going to give us meat to eat? And you know what I'm always like? Somehow when I read the story, I know how the story goes. You guys left Egypt with thousands of cattle and sheep and goats. When you left Egypt, you had flocks and herds. So how is it that this time later, you guys are standing there crying that no one's giving you meat to eat? And you know what they do? They go to the front of their tent and they cry like babies. Nobody's going to give me any meat. Oh, I don't have meat to eat. Who's going to bring me meat? You know what they are? They're, sorry guys, but they're modern Gen Z people on their phone. And I'll give you a million, right? I don't know why you guys do this. I'm an old dude, so it doesn't make any sense to me that, oh, I'm having this terrible tragedy. I better get my phone and make sure I record this. Am I live? Is this on? Oh, I gotta tell you guys something. I'm so distraught, right? Make sure everybody sees how bad it is. And I'm still crying. And I took time to turn my phone on and make sure I could post this on my Instagram and on my TikTok. And they're gonna see how I'm crying. So something is so bad. Is this on? Yeah, okay. That's who these guys are. They're crying at the door of their tent so everybody knows I'm crying because I can't get any meat, and God's angry with that because they got slave mentality, right? And so here they decide, God descends in chapter 14. God descends, and he comes down in that moment, hushes everything. And then verse 11 says, Then the Lord said to Moses, How long will these people reject me? And how long will they not believe me? See, it wasn't about whether they had the strength or the power to take the promised land. God had told them to take the promised land. You know why it's called promised land? Because God had promised it, right? And if God makes a promise, God's not going to break his promise. And it's God who's going to give them the land. See, in every way, shape, and form, they thought it was up to them. But it wasn't. It was up to God. And what these people were saying is, after all I've seen, all I've been through, all the miracles I've watched, all the powerful, mighty moves of God, I watched God come down and punch Pharaoh, the mightiest man on earth, punch him in the face and let us go. And I still won't believe in God. I still won't trust God. I'm still thinking like a slave, trapped in helplessness. Somebody else has got to fix this for me because I'm too helpless to do it myself. And even with God's help, I won't go forward and do it. That's how they're thinking. God comes down to Moses, and I don't want to read the whole thing, but basically God looks at him and he says, Hey, Moses, why don't I just kill everybody, and I'll make a new nation out of you? Let's just do that. I mean, I'll keep Joshua and Caleb. I like them. All these guys, let's just obliterate them. I plan to kill them all right now, and I'll raise up a new nation out of you, and the new nation from you will take the promised land. And honestly, that's quite a temptation for Moses. But he turns around and says, Oh, God, if you kill all these people, the Egyptians are going to say you were a powerless God because you couldn't protect them. And if you kill all these people, the people in the land we're supposed to take are not going to be afraid because they're going to say their God has deserted them. See, God, it's your reputation that's at stake now. Yeah, you could kill all these people and start a new nation with me, and that would be quite a feat, actually, and that would be pretty cool. My name would be big, and I'd be something. I'd be the greatest hero on earth with a new nation rising up and all the promised lands taken from my descendants, but God, you would be shamed. So, Lord, for the sake of your name, let's do something else. And God says, okay, here's basically the plan. This generation of adults, everybody who's 21 years old and older, is never going to see the promised land. They will die in the wilderness because they don't have any faith. And everybody who's 20 years old and younger, that generation and the generation born in the next 40 years, I'll give them the promised land. When this slave mentality is completely died out and a new generation who don't remember slavery much, they arise, they'll be the ones to take the promised land. And this generation, back they're going to go into the desert for the next 40 years. They are never going to see the land flowing with milk and honey. They're never going to get the blessing. They're never going to live in the prosperity. They're never going to live in peace at ease. They're going to live in a desert wilderness, scrubbing and scraping for drinks of water and for food to eat. They're going to live at the bottom in a poor, difficult, nomadic, harsh condition until they're all dead. And another generation will rise up to take the promised land. And it says at the end of chapter 14, verse 36, Now the men whom Moses sent to spy out the land, who returned and made all the congregation complain against him by bringing a bad report of the land, those very men who brought the evil report about the land died by the plague before the Lord. But Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh remained alive of the men who went to spy out the land. So God's like, all this generation who's whining and complaining is dead. All the spies are going to die tonight. They get struck with it, except for these two, Joshua and Caleb. 40 years later, when they reach the promised land, not even Moses gets to go in. The only two who get to go in are Joshua and Caleb. That's why we named our son after Caleb. Like it. His name literally means dog. Right? Means loyal, bold. Joshua's name, his initial name was Hosea, which means salvation. But Moses called him Joshua, which means the Lord is salvation. So the Lord is salvation and loyal, bold dog are the only two who get to get into the promised land. And when they do, it's a really weird moment because they were 40 when they spied out the land. When they take the promised land, they're 80. 85 actually for Caleb in that zone. Nobody of their age is left. Everybody, the next closest age to them is going to be somebody who's 60. Their entire generation died out. And it's like just the two of them. Nobody else is left. They all died in the wilderness except for these two. And they go to take the land. It's a great story. And when they go to take the land, Joshua's like, well, buds, I guess it's you and me. You got first dibs, Caleb, because we were here first. Caleb, what do you want to take? You know what Caleb says? Oh, yeah, I want to take Hebron where the three giants were. Give me that. I'm 85 years old, and now I'm going to go take those giants out that nobody wanted to take out. And Joshua's like, go for it. And he does. He couldn't kill him at 40 because no one would go with him. At 85, he goes and takes him out, right? Because he never lost his faith in God, and God always honored him. It's just crazy to me how these people wish they'd died in Egypt, and they say, oh, I wish we had died in the desert or died in Egypt. And God's like, I'm going to give you that wish. You wish it? I'll bring it. I'll give that. That's what you want? Okay, that's what you're going to get. They had cried that their wives and children would become prey to these other people, and God's like, no. Actually, your wives will die with you, but your children, they're going to take the promised land. They're going to get what you rejected. And then the whole interesting thing to me about this whole sort of crazy wandering and all the stuff that would go on for 40 years, other stuff went on. But the weirdest thing to me when I read this story is that slave mentality that is helpless, no self-sufficiency, someone has to do it for me, and even when God says do it, I won't because I'm afraid. I won't because I'm afraid. Analysis of a situation in your life is when you sit down and you can analyze with your brain and your human power the situation you're facing, and you know how to count the cost, and you look at the resources you have, the talent, skills, and abilities, the money you have in the bank, the money you have coming in, the availability of what you can do. You analyze it all and you come up with a conclusion. Well, what if you do that and the conclusion falls short, but the goal is something God told you to do? What happens then? If you analyze your life and your life cannot do the thing God told you to do you do it anyway? And I would say from this story, the answer is yes, do it anyway. Do it anyway, right? Analyze the whole situation, go forward and do it anyway. Sometimes, this is a lesson I learned, I haven't even learned it. I became aware of the lesson. Sometimes in your life, if the whole group around you will not help you fulfill the mission God has given you, nobody gets to go. Joshua and Caleb did nothing wrong. They stood there in the promised land at 40 years old saying, let's take it. They were faithful people. How come they didn't get to go in the promised land? They trusted God. They didn't give up. But you know what they got? 40 years wandering the desert with everybody else. Because if the whole group won't go, nobody gets to go. Now, God preserved them, brought them into the promised land sometimes later, but Caleb had to spend 40 years in the desert scrubbing out a life because of the sin of other people. It didn't go easy for him because of the sin of other people, not his own sin. Some of you have had a calling from God on your life. Something you feel in your heart and mind you're supposed to be doing for God. Something you're supposed to be spending your life and your energy on. I don't know if it's helping homeless people or dealing with, recovery issues, or I don't know if it's building homes with a Habitat for Humanity. I don't know if it's sharing the gospel in the third world. I don't know what it is. Somewhere there's a passion in your heart to do something for God. And you need to have people around you to help you get into your promised land. Your promised land that flows with milk and honey for you, where the joy and the prosperity and the hope and the wonder happens, and you don't get left wandering in the desert. You have to surround yourself with people of faith who say, we have analyzed the situation, and it's bigger than we can do, but God told us to do it, let's do it anyway. Yes. You have to surround yourself with those people, or you will never get to your own promised land. You have to find that calling, that purpose, that meaning on your life, the thing God wants you to do, and then you have to start measuring and looking around you and saying, who God is supposed to go with me? Because some things I cannot do on my own. I can't do them by myself. It takes people to go with me. And maybe I need to look at the people around me and say, am I with people who have faith in God and are going to help me get to the promised land of what God has called me to do? Or am I with people who have a slave mentality who are quitters and don't have faith in God? And you might need to sort that out. And sometimes it's really hard. When we got ready to sell the building downtown to move up here and buy this building, there was 50 of us. Not including the homeless people. And we went around to each person. We said, okay, we got this shot. Here's what we can do. We found a building that we can buy, but it's going to be super, super difficult. And we asked each family in our church, do you want to do this journey of selling that building and doing this vision that we have? And will you go with us? And a couple of our leaders went and met with a bunch of people in our church. They met with every family who was participating in our church. They sat down with that couple or that individual and said, will you do this journey? Here's what we're going to ask you. For 1 year, hell or high water, good or bad, sink or swim, for 1 year, you will serve with us, you will worship with us, you will keep tithing with us, you will keep giving so that we can take this goal, because there's not enough of us to do this if you quit. And if a bunch of you are going to quit, those of us who want to do this need to count the cost and know beforehand, because if you leave us hanging and we end up getting up there and then a bunch of you quit, we'll be too small to get this done. So will you do the journey with us? And if you want to bow out, no hard feelings. If you leave after a year, no hard feelings. But for 1 year, will you make a vow and a promise to help us achieve this goal of selling this building, buying this thing, building it out, and creating this coffee shop idea that we have? And we got signatures from all those 50 families. I don't know if it was 50, it might have been 40, whatever it was. Jim was one of the guys doing it. And we sold the building. We inked the deal with a real estate person. We inked the deal with this real estate person, signed the documents. We were committed. We were in. And before we'd even packed up and left the building, 6 to 10 families quit. I had names for them, but I can't say them because I'm in church. And they left us hanging. And now we couldn't bow out. We couldn't back out because we'd inked the deal, right? And we felt God was saying to do this. And honestly, a bunch of us looked at each other like, I would like to not do this now. Because we don't have what it's going to take. We don't have the people or the manpower. We came up here to do a very first Sunday service in this building right there, and the place was torn apart and that kind of thing. And the very first Sunday, acoustic guitar, just singing songs in bars on the windows and beer coolers everywhere and that kind of thing. We're singing some song, getting ready to demo, and there was 25 of us left. That's all that was left standing, right? And we were too small to do it. And I can tell you, we spent some time in the wilderness because of that. We spent that year, we couldn't make it. Things went hard. And we kept saying, I kept praying to God, why, Lord? Why would they sign a document committing for a year and then quit? And why did they wait until after we signed the papers to tell us? Because we couldn't get out now. We were stuck. We had to persevere no matter what. And we just kept plodding on. We just kept putting one foot in front of the other, doing this battle, doing this fight, And because they had left and they took their tithing and stuff with them, we had to spend more to keep the operation going, to basically keep afloat the basics. We couldn't do the build out. We ran out of money doing the build out. I can tell you that was a horrible, horrible experience. To sit there and not have the money to do the build out and look at each other like, okay, that fund we had set aside wasn't big enough because we had to spend some of that fund on operations because those people left us. It was hard. It was brutal. We just kept putting one foot in front of the other. And honestly, it's because we couldn't back out. And we were like, we are in for a year. We are in this terrible desert of trying to figure out how to do this. Right? And I'm so thankful to people, and there's a few of them in the room who stayed the course. We're like, I don't know, we'll stay with you. We ran out of money. We inked the deal in July of 2014, and by Thanksgiving, we were flat broke. We didn't even have toilets. And we were broke. And we had to get a church open here. What do we do? What are we supposed to do? Right? 25 of us looking at each other like, are you rich? No, I'm not rich. Got anything you can give? No, I got nothing. And when some lady had died 2 years earlier, they settled her estate. The day before Thanksgiving, we got a $20,000 check. So we could put the floors in and some toilets in. We could get that far, right? Next thing I know, I'm in a meeting and I sit there with Rob McCann of Catholic Charities, and he hears about our coffee shop and comes up here, and I got a Catholic guy on one side, a Mormon guy on the other, Ross on the other side of me, Dave Ross. And Rob says, I want to see this place. And Dave's like, I'd kind of like to see it too. I arranged with Rob that day, and Dave a different day. And we came up here and we're walking around, ceilings torn out, floors still barely in. Toilets we finally got in, needs paint job, needs tons of stuff. And we're standing right where my wife is sitting right now between those two poles. He's got his hands in his pockets and he says, what do you need? What do you need to get this done? I said, probably $75,000. We're broke. He says, I can get you that. So the Catholics gave us, I think when the dust settled, it was like $55,000 or $60,000 to finish. And the next time I meet with Dave, the Mormon, he's like, well, he goes, what do you guys need to get that thing done? I said, we need it painted. We don't have any money to do buy paint, paint the place. He goes, oh, I used to be a professional painter. I'll tell you what, I'll bring a crew up there. I'll bring a crew up there with all my old equipment, which is just sitting in a garage anyway. And so a bunch of Mormons came up here for 3 days and painted the building for us for free. Right? Because God has said, keep going. Keep going. But I can tell you the stress and the anxiety and the tension. My hair was brown when we moved into this building. It's hard to be in the wilderness. And it's really hard to be in a wilderness when other people put you there. It hurts. And some of you might be in a wilderness now, in whatever's gone on in your life. But if you feel God has called you, which I think if you're sitting in church, he has, even if you're like, well, I don't know if I believe in Jesus. Yeah, you're sitting here today, so he believes in you. Right? He's calling you to something. You need to do an inventory of your life and look and say, who is supposed to go with me? Who's supposed to go with me? What's next level? I mean, even look at us now. Is this it? Is the Gathering House doing everything God called us to do? Is this the land flowing with milk and honey and we're in it now and there's no more, just live it out? I don't think so. I still feel like 10 years later in the building, I still feel like we're just getting started, God. We got more to do, more people to reach, more impact to have, more lives that are helpless and lonely and isolated that need to be changed, more gospel shared with people who are on their way literally to hell now and they need to hear about Jesus and get to heaven. More people who are broken in friendships and they're living alone and they don't know anybody. There's more people who need healing and restoration and hope. There's more needed. I don't think we're there yet. Is God calling Gathering House to something bigger? I think so. If you'd asked me 10 years ago, before we moved in and everybody quit on us, if you'd asked me, what do you think, where do you see this church in 10 years? I would have said 10 years ago, we'll be doing at least 2 packed services on a Sunday morning, and we'll have so many people that we'll be talking about buying another building either in the valley or way up on the South Hill and doing a Gathering House too. Right? We would already be there. 10 years ago, that's what I thought we'd be doing. Right? We're just kind of hanging in here now. And I'm like, God, where do you want to take us? What do you want to do? But here's the thing I know. If we don't all go together in faith, nobody gets to go. That's a thought, isn't it? Because a handful of people, your leader, and I am thankful to say, we got some really good leaders now. I've had years where I looked at my church board and I'm like, oh my God, I got the 10 spies sitting at the table with me. Dang it, right? There's times I've been one of the 10 spies. But you want to have people sitting at the table who are Caleb's and Joshua's who say, let's do it. We've counted the cost and we can still do it because God said so. But Gathering House cannot become what it's intended to become if we don't all do it together. And if you think 6 to 8 to 10 of us can do it without you while you just tag along and watch, you're wrong. You're wrong. If we don't all go to the promised land of flowing with milk and honey together, nobody gets to go. That's the lesson I take out of this when I read this story more and more. And it's like, God, Lord, sometimes, and it makes sense, all the New Testament's full of these one another phrases. Encourage one another, strengthen one another, love one another, bear one another's burdens. One another's all over the place. You can't do one another's alone. In order to fulfill those Bible verses, you have to be together. It takes a collective group to fulfill the New Testament one another's. Right? And so if God has a plan for this church, and we are, I would say, we are not a big church, but we are an influential church. But I think God has bigger things still. But if we don't go together, we aren't going to get there. And the go together has to do also with you. What is the calling of God on your life? What is it He's made you to be? What did He create you for? And are you fulfilling that calling? Are you getting into your own personal promised land? If not, take a good look at who's with you, because you need a collective group to achieve everything you want in life. And maybe you're with 10 spies you shouldn't be with. And maybe you need to find the faithful who will go with you and say, we have counted the cost, we can't do it, but God said to do it, so let's do it anyway. And God will come through for us at the right time in the right place. God will come through for me. God will come through for you. But He wants your active participation. He wants you engaging. They had to fight for the promised land. And they got it. But they had to fight for it. And the generation that was not willing to pay a price or make a sacrifice or pick up arms or lift a finger died in the desert. And we don't want to be the generation that dies in the desert. I'm going to leave you with this final verse from Hebrews chapter 3. 1,500 years later-ish, a writer whose name we don't know was writing to the Hebrew people after Jesus' death and resurrection. And he writes this letter to the entire nation of Jews at that time before the temple would be destroyed. And he says in chapter 3, he's talking about faithfulness. He says in verse 7 of chapter 3 of Hebrews, therefore, as the Holy Spirit says, today, if you will hear His voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion, in the day of the trial of the wilderness, where your fathers tested me and tried me and saw my works for 40 years. Therefore, I was angry with that generation and said, they always go astray in their heart, and they have not known my ways. So I swore in my wrath that they shall not enter my rest. Beware, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. But exhort one another daily, while it is still called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. For we have become partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end. While it is said, today, if you will hear His voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. And chapter 4, verse 1 says, therefore, since a promise remains of entering His rest, let us fear lest any of you seem to have come short of it. God is still exhorting us today, don't be like that generation. when you hear my voice calling you to bigger things, higher things, noble things, when you hear me calling you to step out in faith, go. Don't be like the generation that shrinks back, not trusting God and not willing to do it with one another. Why don't you stand with me as we close in prayer? Lord, I feel led today to pray a vision for these people. I just sense that some of them are standing today and they're saying, I have never actually asked God why he made me. I never really thought about the uniqueness of who I am and why God would make me for any kind of specific purpose. God wants you to know he did. He gave you certain talents and abilities and life experiences so that you would become a mighty tool in his hand to accomplish things for his kingdom. And no one else can do exactly what you can do the way you can do it. And so, Lord, I pray for people who have no vision of their own life that you would provide it. That you would begin to awaken in their souls and spirit a calling. They would hear your voice. They would have dreams and hopes and ambitions of something, longings in their heart for what they could do with you and for you and with your people on this earth, a reason they were created, a reason of where they would find their ultimate joy of being in the rest of plenty where their land flows with milk and honey, of the prosperity of being in your great place. Awaken their hearts and souls to their own vision. And then collectively, Lord, for us, I pray that you would awaken a vision for all of us of where you want the gathering house to go. We're here now. We're here now and we're doing this, but it's not complete yet. The complete task of our promised land isn't fulfilled. Would you put a burning heart in all of us and thoughts in us and passions in us and unite them together? We can say, oh, we've heard God call us and here's where we're going to go. And then, Lord, for all of us, give us friendships and acquaintances and people around us that we can say, this is my tribe, and they follow Jesus wholeheartedly. And together we count the cost. We realize we are insufficient to complete the job, but we trust in God anyway, and we're going to step forward to what God says to do. And give us voices who encourage and strengthen, and people of faith and people of hope and people who trust you, God. And all the voices that aren't those voices, would you get rid of them in our lives? By either transforming them and changing them, that's the best, or eliminating them. And so, Jesus, together we step forward and we say, I want to be who God has called me to be, do what God has called me to do, and enter into my own personal promised land, fulfilling the reason for which I was created. This, Jesus, I ask and pray by the power of your Holy Spirit in harmony with your holy word. Amen. Amen. Thank you guys for coming.